Chapter 141 Golden Serpent. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Other the next 5 days, Sonny mostly stayed in his room while his shadow stealthily prowled around the castle, spying on people and learning their secrets. Slowly, he began to understand the undercurrents that flowed beneath the seemingly peaceful surface of life in this pristine white fortress. Of course, in reality, things weren't peaceful at all, and as far from pure as one could imagine. But that was to be expected from a place where hundreds of lost youths lived with no hope of ever finding their way back home, away from all the restraints of civilization. He wasn't surprised at all. If anything, it was strange to see some semblance of law and order, no matter how detestable and revolting, persevere despite all the obstacles that stood in the way. Somehow, the inhabitants of the castle were able to coexist with each other in a fragile balance. The system was cleverly built in a way that allowed the abused to dream of a better life and restrained the abusers from going too far. Better life meant winning Gunlog's favor, while going too far meant losing it and being banished into the cold darkness of the outer settlement. Both fear and hope were created and firmly grasped by the Bright Lord. Their mere existence kept people in their places. Sonny suspected that the same dynamic, just substituted for a different kind of reality, reigned in the slum outside of the castle walls. The outer settlement seemed to exist separate from the castle, but in fact, both were simply parts of one large ecosystem. People on the outside longed to be allowed inside, while people on the inside dreaded being exiled to the outside. Because the possibility of a better life, or a worse one, existed, they were distracted from the fact that, no matter what happened, they would still be spinning in a circle. Like a serpent biting its own tail, the Bright Castle and the outer settlement created a closed cycle of exploitation and abuse that, paradoxically, kept everyone in the dark city sane and alive. It was nothing short of ingenious. Of course, Sonny wanted no part of it. He didn't know how many people were currently surviving in the slum, but there were somewhere around 500 sleepers living in the ancient stronghold. However, not all of them shared the same status. There was a complex hierarchy in place, separating people into different castes. Some of these groups had a distinct place in the hierarchy, while others were less clearly defined. Most of the inhabitants of the castle, unsurprisingly, were directly serving Gunlog. They were guards, hunters, pathfinders, artisans, and handmaidens. Ruling over them were 5 lieutenants who answered directly to the Lord himself, each responsible for their own aspect of the day-to-day life of the fortress. The castle guard was the largest of these groups, consisting of around 150 men. They were in charge of guarding the stronghold and enforcing Gunlog's laws. Just like Castor had said, they were near the bottom of the totem pole in terms of power and status. Anyone with a remotely useful aspect ability could join the guard, and although their training was rather rigorous, actual opportunities to experience combat were few and far between. That was not to say that their job was not dangerous. Every time a stray nightmare creature climbed the hill or attacked from above, it was their duty to either kill or chase the monster away. And out here in the dark city, no monster was anything less than terrifying and absolutely deadly. The castle guard was led by a morose giant of a man named Tezsai, who was one of Gunlog's most trusted lieutenants and perhaps the oldest sleeper on the Forgotten Shore. He was just 2 years short of 30. Tezsai was a ferocious fighter and ruthless commander, holding his subordinates in an iron grip. Above the castle guard, there were hunters. These were the elites of Gunlog's forces, each possessing a powerful combat aspect, rich battle experience, and sharp wit to make use of both. There were around 50 of them, divided into 7 hunting parties. Each morning, as soon as the gates of the castle opened, one of the parties left the safety of the impregnable marble walls and ventured into the harrowing maze of the dark city to hunt and kill awakened creatures. It was thanks to their efforts that people in the ancient stronghold had food on their plates. Without them, none of this would have been possible. Hunters were recruited from the ranks of guards, and becoming a hunter was a dream come true. That was because these professionals enjoyed plentiful rewards from the Lord, such as living in a room of their own as opposed to cramped barracks, better food and access to various luxury items, best memories and tools the bright castle could provide, as well as many other things. Of course, the other side of the coin was that their lives were often the shortest. Despite all their experience and preparations, many never returned from the hunts. And the only reason any did at all was the pathfinders. Pathfinders served as guides for the hunting parties. Just as Effie had said, the secret to surviving in the Dark City was to find and kill comparatively weaker creatures without stumbling into something far more deadly. They made sure to do just that, track the awakened monsters without leading the pack of hunters into the jaws of fallen abominations. There were so few pathfinders that Sunny even questioned whether they could be categorized as a group. In the whole castle, there were less than a dozen. Each of them was a seasoned veteran who earned his role through surviving long years of bloody battles in the ruins, and thus had a chance to live long enough to learn large areas of the Dark City like his own 5 fingers. Needless to say, all of them were incredibly fearsome combatants and enjoyed lavish, sometimes even decadent lifestyles. Both hunters and pathfinders were led by a charismatic man called Gemma. Gemma came to the Forgotten Shore in the same year as Gunlog, and had helped him take control of the castle. Together, these 3 groups, guards, hunters, and pathfinders, formed Gunlog's army, which was simply known as the Host. Chapter 142 Behind the Scenes. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. There were 2 other groups of people that belonged to Gunlog. The first of them consisted of sleepers with useful utility abilities and their helpers. These people, known as artisans, played a very important role in the life of the castle. They were responsible for creating and maintaining various items that were either vital to survival or made existing on the Forgotten Shore less unbearable, such as clothes, tools, equipment, utensils, and various gear. Each artisan had a small team of less gifted sleepers helping them craft the necessary items. All in all, there were around 100 of them in total, with most of that number consisting of the assistants. They were led by a young woman called Keto, who was a talented manager and had an ability that allowed her to change attributes of certain plants. The vegetables in Sunny's stew came from her garden. Since such an ability was nothing short of priceless on the Forgotten Shore, where food was scarce and mostly homogeneous, it wasn't surprising that she had become one of the lieutenants despite being much younger than the rest of them. The status of artisans was somewhat of a tense subject in the Bright Castle. Because they were largely non-combatants, guards felt that their position should be inferior to that of people actually risking their lives in vicious battles against nightmare creatures. Artisans, on the contrary, believed that the rarity of utility aspects and the vital role they played in maintaining the living conditions inside the castle should land them more prestige than the castle guard, which basically recruited any random nobody, enjoyed. This conflict had been simmering for a long time, and was not going to be resolved anytime soon. Funnily enough, hunters, who risked their lives the most, did not care about the issue one way or another. Their leader Gemma, however, was silently supporting the artisans and their chief, Keto, which prevented the guards from being too forceful in their argument. The last group of people who belonged to Gunlog was the handmaidens. These were the young women Sunny had seen quietly performing various chores around the castle, like making sure that windows were properly closed before the onset of the night or preparing and handing out food during mealtime. They were responsible for maintaining the castle itself, as well as serving the high-ranking members of the host. There were also around 100 of them. From what Sunny knew about the world, these poor girls should have been the prime victims of abuse within the walls of the ancient stronghold, but to his surprise, they were actually strangely revered, and even a little feared. The main reason for this was their leader, a mysterious and strikingly beautiful woman known as Saishan. Saishan not only took care of her handmaidens, but also secretly taught them how to defend themselves. The exact extent of their training was unknown, but Sunny clearly saw that members of the castle guard were very careful to behave themselves around handmaidens, most of the time. The other reason was that, like everything else in the castle, the young women technically belonged to Gunlog, and Gunlog was very particular about people laying hands on his belongings without permission. Even if some foolish guard was brave enough to anger Sishan, no one with a desire to live was willing to get on the bad side of the Bright Lord. Sunny, however, was already scared enough by Sishan herself. The first time he had sent his shadow to take a look at what the handmaidens were up to when no one was watching, it had almost gotten caught. That was the first time someone managed to sense his shadow. One moment, beautiful Sishan was calmly standing with her back to the shaded corner where it was concealed, giving instructions to one of her subordinates, and in the next, she suddenly turned around and looked directly at the hiding shadow. Not knowing what else to do, Sunny shut his eyes and shifted all of his perception back. He was fairly sure that no one would be able to directly see the shadow. After all, his innate stealth enhancement was even more pronounced when it came to his silent companion. However, there were a lot of different aspects. Many awakened, for example, were able to feel when someone was looking at them. Praying that this was the case here, Sunny waited for a while before cautiously opening one eye. Luckily, this time, he didn't cause too much of a commotion. Confirming that Sishan had returned to her conversation, he hurriedly sent the shadow away and made sure to stay away from the mysterious beauty, and her handmaidens in general, ever since. The last 100 people in the castle were those who paid tribute, but didn't serve Gunlog directly. There was no real name for this group, so Sunny simply called them tenants in his mind. There were two types of tenants. A smaller number of them were those who were able to make a decent living by providing Gunlog's men with various services, mostly having to do with craftsmanship and entertainment. For example, there was a man who created something akin to a music lounge, another one who operated a small theater troupe, and even an entrepreneurial girl who owned a gambling den. A larger number of tenants were people like Harper, those who had entered the castle through luck and remained there by the skin of their teeth, desperately trying to earn soul shards for tribute by acting as servants and doing various menial jobs. These poor folks were at the very bottom of the social hierarchy of the castle. And on the opposite side of that hierarchy, there was the Golden Serpent, the master of the castle, Bright Lord Gunlog himself. The man who, by Effie's description, was nearly immortal. On his 5th day in the ancient stronghold, Sunny had finally laid eyes on this loathsome tyrant. He didn't like what he saw at all. Chapter 143 Gunlog. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Despite the fact that Gunlog's heavy presence permeated every centimeter of the castle, the Bright Lord himself was strangely elusive. He didn't show himself often, preferring to rule through his 5 proxies. Whether it was out of arrogance, paranoia or some other reason, Sunny did not know. After the incident with Sishan, he was afraid to let his shadow walk too freely and tried to avoid going anywhere near the fearsome master of the ancient stronghold. Because of these precautions, he had not seen Gunlog until their 5th day in the castle. As it turned out, when Golden Serpent did show up, he liked to leave an impression. Sunny and Cassie were about to receive their usual breakfast when the whole grand hall suddenly grew deathly silent. Feeling that something was wrong, they turned to the entrance, just in time to see a torrent of guards pouring inside. Sunny's heart skipped a beat. What's this? Fearing for the worst, he tried to think of the best way to escape, but luckily, the menacing soldiers of the host paid them no attention. Instead, they quickly dispersed around the hall and moved the long tables to the walls, creating a large open space in the middle. Cassie grasped Sunny's shoulder and whispered. What is going on? He hesitated, then answered uncertainly. I'm not sure. Suddenly, he caught sight of Castor standing among the crowd. The handsome young man had a solemn look on his face. His gaze was turned to the dark alcove at the far end of the hall. One by one, all the sleepers turned to face the same direction. Sunny followed their example. Slowly, 5 figures stepped out of the darkness of the alcove and stood at the steps leading up to the throne. They were Gemma, Tessai, Sishan, Keto, and the last of the 5 lieutenants. When Sunny noticed him, an involuntary shudder ran through his body. The 5th lieutenant had no official duties in the Bright Castle, but everyone here feared him the most. It was a strange, pale man with a bony face and glassy, emotionless eyes. His spine was twisted, making him appear deceptively short. The hunchback was wearing simple black clothes with no adornments and holding himself with a bit of awkwardness, as though uncomfortable with all the attention. His name was Haruz, and he was Bright Lord's hidden blade and executioner. When someone needed to be disposed of, he was sent to carry out the punishment. If Gunlog wanted everyone to know about his displeasure, there would be rivers of blood left in his wake. If not, there wouldn't be even a single drop. People would just disappear, as though they had never existed. Haruz was Gunlog's murderous shadow. Many of the inhabitants of the castle had seen nightmares in which they awoke only to see his glassy, cold eyes staring at them from the darkness. For some, those nightmares became a reality. Haruz was willing and eager to follow any command of his master, no matter how vile. What disturbed Sunny the most, however, was that looking at Haruz was like looking at a dark mirror. Despite the fact that they were almost nothing alike, for some reason, he couldn't help but recognize traces of himself in the sadistic butcher. Or, to be precise, of a possible future version of himself. No way. I am much more pleasant on the eye. Forcing himself to look away before the hunchback felt his stare, Sunny turned his head and looked at the tall man who had finally appeared from the darkness. At least he assumed that it was a man, and not some golden demon. Bright Lord Gunalug was clad in a strange, gilded armor that covered his tall figure from head to toe, not leaving even his eyes exposed. It seemed simultaneously solid and liquid, almost flowing over his mighty muscles and broad, powerful shoulders. In the place where his face should have been, a smooth and empty expanse of polished gold reflected the frightened faces of hundreds of sleepers back at them. Sunny saw his own reflection staring at him and suddenly realized how small and weak he was in front of this brilliant giant. His legs trembled. The pressure Gunlog exerted on the space around him was almost palpable. All the people near Sunny were going through a similar kind of experience as him. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, drops of sweat appearing on their temples. Even the lieutenants seemed slightly uncomfortable, affected by this oppressive aura just like the rest of them. God damn it, that's not an aura, that's a mind attack. Protected by the, doubtless, trait of the puppeteer's shroud, Sunny was more resistant to such attacks than most. Gritting his teeth, he shook off the effects of Gunlog's psychic pressure and drew in a deep breath. Then, he glanced at Cassie, concerned about her well-being. To his surprise, the blind girl was doing absolutely fine. Unlike the rest of them, she wasn't showing any signs of distress. Sunny stared at her and blinked a couple of times. The reflection, this all started when I saw my reflection in the visor of that bastard's weird armor, but Cassie is blind, so. It seemed as though Gunlog wasn't actually attacking them. It was just an enchantment of that strange golden armor of his. Whoever looked at its mirror-like face was immediately assaulted by a crippling feeling of awe, dread, and the crushing desire to submit. What kind of a memory can practically paralyze several hundred people just from its passive effect? Sunny thought, astonished. How was this possible? Meanwhile, Gunlog approached the empty white throne and gracefully sat down. The light falling from the numerous holes in the back wall of the alcove reflected from his armor, making it appear as though he was enveloped by a bright radiance. The golden mirror that served him as a face turned to gaze at the rows of sleepers trembling at his feet. A few moments later, a deep and insidious voice resounded from all around them, as though the castle itself was whispering into their ears. Ah, what a nice day it is today. A perfect day for justice, don't you think, my precious wards? I've heard that there's a criminal hiding among us today. Well, am I not fair? Am I not just? Let me show you how just I am. Chapter 144 Right of Challenge. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Sunny felt cold sweat running down his back. Shaken by Gunlog's serpentine voice, he was tempted to fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. However, he also understood that every person in the Grand Hall currently felt the same urge. Everyone here had done something that might be considered a crime by the tyrant. He almost expected to hear people begin confessing their sins, but at that moment, a strange commotion at the doors attracted his attention. Moving with menacing determination, 2 guards dragged a man to the center of the hall and threw him on the floor. The man was dressed in rags and painfully lean, which betrayed his nature as a dweller of the outer settlement. However, there were ropes of powerful muscles rolling under his thin skin, and an angry, fearless look in his eyes that made the man appear proud and defiant. Throwing a contemptuous stare at the guards, he picked himself up from the floor and stood up, his back straight and his head held high. There was no ounce of fear on his face. Instead, there was dark, furious resentment. Gunnlaug looked down on the brave man from his throne and slightly tilted his head. The outsider grimaced after seeing his reflection in the golden mask, but still didn't lower his head. That's pure willpower, Sunny thought, impressed by the stranger. Meanwhile, Bright Lord's voice resounded in the grand hall once again. My wards. We have a guest today. This man, called Jubiai, is visiting us from the outer settlement. Recently, he had been heard leveraging an accusation against one of my men. As a just and benevolent lord, I have invited Jubiai here to plead his case and expose the criminal. We must get to the bottom of this matter. After all, the law is our only guiding star in this dark world. Despite being free from the psychic pressure emanated by Gunnlaug's armor, Sunny still felt strangely affected by his deep, soft voice. He even got goosebumps. With or without the golden memory, Bright Lord possessed a powerful and ingratiating charisma. It was hard not to listen to him. But the man called Jubiai just smirked. That's right. I'm here to accuse one of your thugs, Gunnlaug. Let's see how you'll get out of this one, bastard. With that, he raised one hand and pointed a finger at the group of hunters watching the proceeding from their usual corner of the grand hall. That man right there, one of your so-called pathfinders, is guilty of murder. He had killed an innocent kid in the most repugnant of ways. I've been watching you and your minions commit all sorts of vile crimes over these years, but enough is enough. Today, I'll see him answer with his life for what he did. A wave of shocked whispers ran through the crowd. Accusing a pathfinder was not something a sane person would ever do. Due to their venerated status, these men were nearly untouchable. And yet, Jubiai seemed unrelenting. Gunnlaug spoke. Is that so? That is a heavy accusation, Jubiai. Please, tell us more. The man from the outer settlement gritted his teeth. That scum and his people lured a naive kid into their party by promising him all kinds of rewards and riches. They told him that he is going to become one of them and come to live in your damn castle. But in reality, they just fed him to the monsters as bait. He spat on the floor. You dare to call yourself hunters, you damn cowards. Don't you have any shame? A heavy silence settled in the grand hall. People were now staring at the group of hunters with dark expressions on their faces. The inhabitants of the castle were used to pretending to be blind to all kinds of wicked deeds, but all those deeds were committed by humans against other humans. What they couldn't forgive was a human being betraying another of their kind to the nightmare creatures. In the dark city, this was tantamount to sacrilege. Gunnlaug turned his head to face the hunters, who shivered under his gaze. Is this true? The oldest of the group, the Pathfinder, glanced darkly at Jubiai and scowled. There must be some kind of a misunderstanding, my lord. The boy in question was a highly valued member of my party. We all had high hopes for his future. His death saddened all of us a great deal. His voice was steady and calm. Perhaps even a little too calm. Jubiai snarled. Lies. I happened to be hunting on that day myself and saw everything with my own 2 eyes. I know what you did, bastard. Gunnlaug turned to face the crows and sighed. After some time had passed, he solemnly said. What an unfortunate situation. It seems that it is your word against his, Jubiai. What to do, what to do? I trust my brave men wholeheartedly, of course. Who would be so ungrateful as to distrust these heroes when they are the ones keeping you all alive? Surely, there's no one that vile and wicked among you, my precious wards. Sonny held his breath, feeling singled out by the insidious voice. The chilling threat hidden behind these words was not very subtle. Gunnlug was silent for a few moments, battering the crowd with his oppressive psychic aura. Then, he turned away, letting the people breathe, and said, "But it would be unbecoming of me to play favorites in such a grave matter. And this matter, oh, it is grave indeed. What a dilemma. How do we uphold justice, my wards?" In the ensuing silence, Gemma, the leader of both hunters and pathfinders, suddenly spoke. "My lord, if I may speak. Isn't there a law that suits this situation perfectly? It has existed for as long as humans lived in this ancient castle. I'm talking, of course, about the right of challenge." He glanced at Jubiai and smiled. If this brave hunter has any shadow of doubt about his accusation, he should step down. If not, he can challenge the criminal and prove it with blood. Of course, the real culprit here is me. As the person responsible for these men, any crime they commit in their roles as hunters is my fault. Gemma's charismatic smile was wide and friendly. "So how about, Jubiai? Will you step down? Or do you want to challenge me?" The hunter from the outer settlement glared at him for a while, his eyes burning with fury and contempt. Finally, he spat. "Do you think I'm afraid of you, lapdog? Sure, why not? I challenge you." Chapter 145 Justice. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The whole spectacle was so smoothly orchestrated that Sonny was almost tempted to believe in it. Of course, he knew better. The only thing he didn't know was whether the bits performed by the Pathfinder and Gemma were rehearsed in advance or improvised on the fly to fulfill their lord's desire to maintain appearances while having the man who had dared to speak openly against him publicly executed. And that was what this was, an execution. Sonny didn't believe for a second that Gunnlog was going to give the brave hunter a chance to leave the Grand Hall alive. No, he wanted him dead, and he wanted everyone to see him die. Lest they get the idea that it was possible to run their mouths against him and escape unscathed. And yet, a tiny ember of hope still burned in Sonny's heart. From the looks of it, Jubiai was an experienced hunter. A capable, seasoned warrior who faced numerous monsters and ended up on top every time. He was very strong, with enough willpower and resolve to crush rocks into dust. Perhaps a miracle would happen. No matter how small, there was a possibility. That's why Sonny couldn't understand why Gunnlog would be willing to risk his right-hand man's life in this farce. As though reading his thoughts, the bright lord spoke. "A challenge. Ah, so be it. This is a sacred tradition, indeed. As long as good men are willing to put their lives on the line for the sake of righteousness, depravity can't win." The crowd of sleepers exploded into whispers. Some of them were tense and somber, others filled with dark anticipation. The corner of Sonny's mouth turned downwards. From what he could see, depravity had already won, or at least gotten the upper hand. But Gunnlog wasn't done speaking. "However, it would not be suitable for you to represent the accused personally, Gemma. The Bright Castle can't afford to lose you, my friend. Jubiai, would you mind if the accused chose another champion?" The hunter from the outer settlement simply shrugged and said. "Bring your worst, cowards." Bright Lord turned to the Pathfinder and tilted his head. With his suddenly pale face reflected in the eerie mask of the strange golden armor, the murderer remained silent for a few moments, and then said in a quiet voice. "I choose Haruz, my lord." Everyone suddenly grew silent. Sonny himself felt cold shivers running down his spine. Why did it have to be that creepy wicked cripple? In the deathly silence, Jubiai smirked and spat with grim satisfaction. Even better. It seemed that he had a score to settle with the silent hunchback, too. "Haruz, who had looked a little bored and uncomfortable through the whole procedure, stared at the Pathfinder who had named him with no particular expression on his bony face, and then slowly walked down the steps. The other lieutenants reacted to this unexpected turn of events differently. Gemma frowned and threw a quick glance at Gunlog before stepping back with a dark expression. Tezai grinned, as though expecting a good spectacle. Kido grew a little pale and took a little step sideways, trying to distance herself from the descending hunchback as much as possible. Only Saishin remained silent and indifferent, not allowing any emotion to appear on her cold, beautiful face. Realizing what was about to happen, Cassie squeezed Sunny's arm and whispered. "Sunny, I want to leave." After a short pause, he answered in a raspy voice. "I'm sorry. We can't leave now." Despite the fact that he didn't want to be anywhere near Gunlog's scarecrow, he knew that leaving now would draw too much attention. They couldn't risk that in the presence of all 5 lieutenants, not to mention Golden Serpent himself. What's more, his mission in the castle was to gather as much information as possible. He couldn't miss the chance to see one of the most dangerous creatures in this deceptively peaceful stronghold in action. And there was this dark feeling deep within his heart that one day, somehow, he and Haruz were going to end up bloodied, with only one of them walking away alive from the fight. It was as though an invisible thread connected them together. Perhaps it was a string of fate. Meanwhile, the hunchback descended from the steps and stopped opposite Jubiai in the empty space that had been cleared in the center of the grand hall. His face was still motionless and a little bored. Sunny held his breath. As Gunlog sat silently on the white throne, Jubiai summoned his memories. A flexible armor made out of red scales appeared on his body, complete with a winged helmet and a kite shield. In his hand, a curved scimitar weaved itself from the sparks of light. Its blade was as sharp as a razor. The hunter glanced at Haruz and said in a steady voice. "Let's see what you're capable of, Butcher." The hunchback just looked at him with his glassy eyes and silently allowed his thick cloak to fall on the floor. Then, he grimaced and straightened his spine as much as he could, suddenly losing the appearance of a small and fragile cripple. At his full height, Haruz towered above most of the sleepers in the grand hall, losing only to the giant Tezai. His monstrous, twisted shape radiated a sense of deep, bestial power. He didn't bother to summon any memories, staring at the hunter with the same cold indifference. Jubiai scowled. So be it. Full of anxiety, Sunny held his breath. The proud hunter lunged forward, raising his shield and at the same time slashing with the scimitar. His movements were incredibly fast and nimble, his technique sharpened by years of bloody battles in the Dark City and guided by rich experience. Good, he's good. Did Jubiai really have a chance? As Sunny's eyes widened, Haruz seemed to miss the attack completely. As though forgetting that he wasn't armed, the hunchback simply raised a hand to meet the razor-sharp blade. And gripped it with his bare fist, stopping Jubiai's strike in its tracks. For a fraction of a second, everyone in the grand hall froze in astonishment, except for the hunter, who immediately tried to wrestle his scimitar from the iron grip of the Gunlog's killer. But it was of no use. It was as though the saber was stuck in stone. It wouldn't have mattered anyway. In the next moment, Haruz moved forward with a snake-like speed and put his large hand on Jubiai's shoulder. Then, with a sickening sound, he effortlessly tore the entire arm off. Somebody screamed. As blood spilled on the marble floor, the proud hunter stared at the stump that had suddenly replaced his dominant arm in disbelief, not yet feeling the terrible pain that would soon follow. However, it never did. Before Jubiai could even react, Haruz grasped his head with both hands and snapped his neck in one brutal, violent motion. Then, he hit the hunter in the chest, shattering his ribs and sending the body flying back a dozen meters. The broken corpse of the defiant challenger fell on the floor, rivers of blood flowing from its terrible wounds onto the pristine white stones. From start to finish, the whole fight took no more than 5 seconds. Haruz looked at his hands, shook a few crimson droplets off, and then silently returned to his place beside the master of the castle, his expression still cold. However, it wasn't bored anymore. Instead, it was full of subtle glee. After all, he had just helped his lord pass down judgment. This was law, this was tradition. This was justice. Chapter 146 Power. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Several hundred sleepers stared at the disfigured body, horrified. Jubiai's scale armor disappeared in a rain of light, leaving him dressed only in torn, bloodied rags. A surprised, dazed expression was still frozen on his face. Awash in blood and broken, the man who had been proud and defiant just a minute ago was now nothing but a pathetic corpse. He was sprawled on the floor in a glistening crimson puddle, reminding everyone of one simple truth. Never, ever dare to disobey Gunlog, the Bright Lord. Or you'll end up just the same. Sunny was probably one of the only two people in the grand hall who wasn't looking at the corpse. Instead, he was looking at Haruz. Haruz himself was staring at the wall, absolutely disinterested in the gruesome fruit of his dark labor. What else was I hoping for? Stupid. Hope is a poison. It will only get you killed. Sunny knew all the facts, but only now had he finally understood how hopeless it was to even think about challenging the Golden Serpent. Everything in the Dark City was designed to make him and his army invincible. That was how the damn hunchback had managed to defeat the experienced hunter from the outer settlement so easily, using nothing but his raw strength. He hadn't even had to show his aspect ability. Why was the divide in their physical prowess so vast? That was because with every human in the Dark City possessing the same dormant core, there were only two things that could make someone more powerful than the rest. Soul essence and memories. And both were monopolized by Gunlog. Only he possessed the manpower and knowledge to freely hunt in the Dark City. This way, he had become the only person with a reliable source of both soul shards and memories in his possession. Whatever crumbs the independent hunters were able to acquire would inevitably end up in his hands, too, because Gunlog also controlled the primitive economy in this cursed place. By providing food and safety in exchange for the so-called tribute, he made sure that all the resources would flow in only one direction. Into his hands. With soul shards and a vast arsenal of memories, he could make his army stronger, which in turn would bring him more soul shards and memories, which in turn would make his army stronger, and so forth. It was a simple, perfect, and harrowing cycle that made his power more and more absolute with each revolution. By the time Sunny, Nephis and Cassie had arrived in the Dark City, the divide between Gunlog's forces and everyone else here was too wide to ever be bridged. Sunny had no doubt that most of the elite warriors of the host had their cores saturated with soul essence to the brim. There was a limit to how many soul shards a nightmare spell carrier could absorb before reaching the bottleneck of their rank, although few ever did. Advancing to the next rank removed that bottleneck and enhanced their bodies according to the saturation level of the core. But with no way to advance, people in the Dark City could only rely on the raw amount of soul essence to accumulate power. This meant that within these ancient walls, sworn into servitude to a single man, there lived the most powerful group of sleepers to ever exist in human history. And this was the man Nephis planned to kill. With a shudder, Sunny remembered Effie's words. No sleeper can defeat Gunlog, ever. It's simply impossible. He also remembered dozens of skulls swinging in the wind above the castle gates. Curse it all, what is she going to pull me into this time? I really have to persuade her to give up for once. My life might depend on it. But somehow, he doubted that Changing Star even knew how to give up. At least not when it came to her mysterious goal. Curses. Sunny was so consumed by these dark thoughts that he even neglected to listen to Gunlog's farewell speech. He had the general idea of what kind of bullcrap the bastard was proselytizing anyway. Soon, the Bright Lord had left his white throne and disappeared into the darkness behind it. The lieutenants followed, with Haruz being the last one to leave. As soon as they were gone, the body of Jubiai was unceremoniously dragged away, and a group of handmaidens silently wiped the puddle of blood off the pristine marble floor. The tables were moved back to their places, and the crowd of sleepers was invited to return to their breakfast. As if nothing had happened. However, Sonny had completely lost his appetite. Leading Cassie away, he glanced at the plates full of food and thought without humor. I guess there's a first time for everything. For the remaining 2 days, Sonny had done nothing but frantically gather information. Knowing that he will be leaving the castle soon, he became a little bit bolder in where to send his shadow. He spent a lot of time spying on the hunters and pathfinders, learning their tactics and secrets. He observed how guards were trained. He learned which artisans were important, and which were not. The only caste he tried to avoid was the handmaidens. He even studied various engravings and stone carvings that decorated the walls of the castle. Finally, the week they had paid tribute for came to an end. On the dawn of the 8th day, Sonny and Cassie once again appeared in the large hall with beautiful stained glass windows and saw the gates of the castle. Despite the fact that there was nothing outside these gates but a dirty slum, Sonny felt relieved. He couldn't wait to leave this damn place. Why do people even want to live here? As soon as he finished this thought, Sonny realized that he didn't actually know what life in the outer settlement was like. Perhaps the castle was actually a paradise in comparison. I doubt it. How bad can it actually be? I guess they just never lived in the outskirts. Shaking his head, he walked toward the gates, but then stopped when someone called his name. Turning his head, Sonny noticed the familiar young man with a thin face and nervous eyes. Today, Harper seemed to be especially distressed. His clothes were a bit less tidy, and there were a few ugly blotches of ink on his parchment. Ah! Son. Sunless and Kasha, right. Goodness, it has already been a week. Ah, where was I? Oh, yes. Are you guys here to pay tribute for the next one? Sonny stared at him for a few minutes, then forced out a smile and pretended to be sad. No. We haven't been able to, earn shards. So, we're leaving. Maybe we will see each other again, someday. Harper opened his eyes wide and stuttered. What? Why would I be, sorry. I'm very sorry that you couldn't stay longer. But don't despair. Lord Gunlog is truly kind, and life is unpredictable. I'm sure you'll be able to come back soon. Sonny gave him a curt nod and turned away. I hope not. Not too soon, at least. With that, they passed through the gates and left the bright castle, the promised castle they had spent so much time seeking and dreaming of. What a disappointment it all had been. Standing under the gray skies of the forgotten shore once again, Sonny and Cassie breathed in the cold fresh air and both smiled. Cassie tugged on his sleeve. Sonny, what do we do now? He looked at the pitiful slum that lay beneath them and answered without having to think for too long. What else? We go find Nephis. Chapter 147 Guildhall. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Cassie smiled, but then suddenly frowned and asked. But, Sonny, how do we find her? He thought for a few seconds, then shrugged. I'm not sure. Follow the sounds of mayhem. This place is not that big. I'm sure we'll manage. They descended the stairs and entered the slum, with Sonny looking around in search of the distinct tall figure. There weren't that many sleepers in the outer settlement who possessed an armor-type memory, so he was sure of his ability to notice changing star in the crowd. Soon, they were surrounded by makeshift hovels and people that had empty, bleak eyes. Some of them stared at them with pity, realizing that the two had just been sent away from the castle, others openly gloated. Sonny paid them no attention. Once again, he was surprised by the sharp contrast between the castle and the outer settlement. No matter how vile the underside of the ancient stronghold was, people were actually living there, walking around with mostly mundane human worries written on their faces. Here in the slum, people were merely existing, and barely at that. In their eyes, there was a more dire need and a more consummate fear. The need to find food for the day, the fear of being devoured by some unseen monster in the night. They were all gaunt, cold, and listless. The only time hope appeared on their faces was when their gazes accidentally fell on the bright castle. Hope will get you killed, fools. You have it better here than those poor souls in the fortress. All in all, it was not so different from the outskirts, with the added terror of nightmare creatures waiting somewhere in the shadows. But then, there were monsters in the real world as well. They just wore human skin. Sunny was once again reminded of how surprisingly well prepared he was for the trials of the nightmare spell, his lack of education not included. Surprisingly, there was no sign of Nephice anywhere. They walked through the entire settlement before finally catching the glimpse of her. At the very edge of the slum, perched precariously above the vertical fall from the stone platform, stood an uncharacteristically spacious dwelling. It was crudely put together out of slabs of stone that had been unceremoniously scavenged from the ruins, with many of them still bearing the intricate carvings left behind by the original inhabitants of the Dark City. This barbarous atrocity was the closest to the road of white stone out of the entire outer settlement. Perhaps that was why it seemed to be a bit sturdier than the rest of the hovels. The lodge even had a small addition built on top of it, somewhat resembling a second story. Changing Star was sitting on its roof with her legs crossed, gazing at the rising sun and the cursed city below. In the pale light of dawn, her ivory skin and silver hair looked beautiful and eerie. She had dismissed her armor and was wearing a crude tunic, with a piece of rope tied around her waist. Sensing their approach, Nephice turned her head and glanced in their direction. Then, she stood up and jumped down, landing lightly on the stone surface of the vast platform. Sunny grinned. "Hey, Neph. Long time no see." Nephice led them inside the stone lodge, which had turned out to be her new residence. The interior was Spartan and austere, with pieces of broken furniture lying here and there and cold winds sweeping freely through the spacious hall of the first floor. Despite its larger size and superior craftsmanship, the lodge had been empty when she found it. No one wanted to live this close to both the edge of the platform at the threshold of the road, where the risk of being attacked by nightmare creatures was the highest. But Changing Star didn't mind. Looking around, Sunny scoffed. "Gee. This place surely needs some work." Neph shrugged, seemingly not very concerned with her living conditions. Well, they did spend the past 2 months sleeping on nothing but rocks and dirt, so in a sense, even this ramshackle mess was an enormous improvement. With some improvements, it could even become somewhat of a decent place. Suddenly, Sunny felt a little guilty about all the comfort and warmth he had experienced in the castle. He was even fed delicious fresh food twice a day. Speaking of food. Cassie smiled and handed Neph a small bundle. Concerned about her friend, she had not eaten her supper the previous evening, choosing to save it for this moment. "Here, Neph. I brought you something to eat." Changing Star received the bundle with a faint smile and lingered a little before saying, "Thank you. Do you guys want breakfast?" With that, she walked over to a flimsy wooden table that stood near one of the walls and removed a piece of cloth from it. Beneath, there was a pile of juicy roasted meat. It was sizable enough to feed 10 people in the castle for a day or two. Sunny stared at the meat blankly, then moved his eyes to stare at Nephice. "Where the hell did you get all this meat? We thought you would be starving here in the outer settlement." She touched her hair in embarrassment. "Oh, a few nights ago, a big monster came from the road. I and a few other people managed to kill it. This is my share of the spoils." Cassie opened her eyes wide. "But I thought that Gunlog's men were supposed to fight off nightmare creatures." Changing Star remained silent for a few seconds. "They do if the castle is attacked either from the slopes of the hill or from the sky. If the monsters come from the road, they usually don't bother to do anything. So that's why all the nearby hovels were empty. Who would want to live in the direct path of attacking nightmare creatures, especially since people who were supposed to fight them weren't going to move a finger to help. Sunny smiled darkly. That's the glorious castle guard for you. Wait. He blinked, then glared at Nephi. If that is true, then why on earth, dream realm, would you choose to live in this pit, of all places? She stared at him for a while, then said in a flat tone. It's quiet here. Then, a small smile appeared on Neff's lips. Turning to a window, she added. I like it. Chapter 148 Last Harvest. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Behind the window, a striking vista of the cursed city sprawled far below. The morning sun washed the ruins in a pale light, making them look menacingly mysterious. Nephi smiled. Besides, what can compete with this killer view? As though answering her words, a ghastly wail resounded from somewhere far away, echoing in the wind like a dying scream. Sunny trembled. I guess she meant it literally. With a sigh, he put Changing Star's strange choice of habitat at the back of his mind and approached the pile of meat. Let's eat first. The three of them sat on the stone floor and ate monster meat, passing around Cassie's beautiful glass bottle between each other. It was just like the good old times, provided that those times were not actually that old, and there had certainly not been anything good about them. Almost. When all three of them were satiated, Nephi looked at Sunny with calm intensity. For some reason, he was reminded of the unseen waves of pressure that Gunlog created anywhere he went. What have you learned in the castle? He sighed. This was going to be a long conversation. Sunny started by describing the general order of things in the ancient stronghold. He told Neff about the 6 different castes and the complex relationships that existed between them, as well as briefly explaining how the members of each caste lived their lives. Sometimes, Cassie would add a few details of her own. Changing Star frowned. Wait, did you say that there were 500 people living in the castle? Sunny gave her a nod. Yes, somewhere around that. Why? She thought for a bit, then said. That doesn't make sense. There are almost as many people here in the outer settlement, perhaps even more. That would put the human population of the Dark City at around 1,000. Most of them are fairly young, too, which would mean that each year, hundreds upon hundreds of us are sent to the Forgotten Shore, with most somehow managing to survive and reach the Bright Castle. She paused. But I haven't seen a single sleeper of our crop here in the slum. As far as I know, we 3 are the only ones to come to the Dark City after the recent solstice. Sunny scratched the back of his head and said with reluctance. Actually, it's 4. Castor is also here. He's living comfortably in the castle. Nephi suddenly grew strangely animated. Castor of the Hanley clan. He is here. No need to be so enthusiastic, damn it. Sunny tried not to grimace. Yeah. He had been here pretty much this entire time. Actually, Castor had told us that there were only 7 sleepers sent to the Forgotten Shore by the spell this year. Strange, I know. He paused for a few moments, and then added. Truth be told, I noticed this discrepancy as well. But there is an explanation. You see, there seems to be a pattern to how many people the spell sends here. 15 years ago, when a bunch of crazy humans first laid claim to the castle, there would be just a dozen or so newcomers each year. Then a few dozen. Then 100. In the past few years, it was several hundred each time. Sunny gestured at the 3 of them. Until this year, that is, when mere 7 sleepers arrived. Since the spell is obsessed with the number 7, some people believe that this marks the end of a 14-year-long cycle and the first year of a new one. I think it's plausible. Changing Star thought for a bit, then asked. How does Castor know the total number of new arrivals? That was a good question, naturally. One that Sunny had asked himself many times before finally convincing himself to go find the handsome Legacy and ask him directly. There's an artisan in the castle with a weird type of revelation ability. She can trace the general location of everyone a person had ever met. Castor paid her a bunch of soul shards to check if any of his acquaintances made it to the Forgotten Shore. She told him there were 6. Nephias was silent for a few moments, then simply said, "Continue." Sonny did. He briefly mentioned the main points of everything he had been able to learn, including all the vile crap he had to witness and his own thoughts on how things worked under the pristine white surface of the magnificent fortress. Inevitably, he had to describe how ingenious and unassailable Bright Lord's hold over the Dark City was. Cassie grew pale and quiet during his somber account. Changing Star's face grew darker and darker with each word. When he told her about the travesty of a trial that ended with Jubiai's harrowing death and shared his own thoughts on how powerful the host truly was, the corners of her mouth turned downward. Finally, he came to the conclusion. And that is why Gunlog can never be defeated. He controls every facet of life here, both material and abstract. Food, shelter, hope, fear, everything comes under the purview of his authority, and his authority is absolute. Even power itself is his to give and take. Out here, Gunlog might as well be considered a god. Nephias remained silent for a long time, and then quietly said, "He is not a god. He is just an impostor." Sonny chuckled. "In this hell, is there a difference?" She glanced at him sharply and gritted her teeth. After a few minutes spent in tense silence, Neph suddenly said, "Still. That only explains why Gunlog can't be overthrown in a rebellion. Why didn't anyone simply kill him in his sleep? Why didn't one of his lieutenants stage a coup? After all, this is how tyrants usually end, by the hand of their most trusted ally." Sonny smiled darkly. "Ah, well. That is because up until now, I only told you about his power as a ruler. Which is, by all accounts, nothing short of terrifying. But his personal power." He shivered, then added in a hoarse voice, "It's way, way worse." Chapter 149 Dark Diver. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Sonny was silent for a while, then sighed. "Do you remember how Effie told us that he might as well be considered immortal? Well, she wasn't wrong. Apart from the fact that Gunlog has probably absorbed more soul essence and has more experience fighting both Nightmare Creature and Awakened than anyone else on the Forgotten Shore, there's more to him than that." Nephias frowned. "Is his aspect ability uniquely powerful?" Sonny shook his head. "His aspect ability is that he is able to breathe and move with incredible speed underwater. But it is connected to what I am about to tell you." He hesitated. "You see, Gunlog came to the Dark City around 8 years ago. Since his ability was of no use in the ruins, he quickly became an outcast. From what I was able to learn, things were even darker in the castle back then. Strength decided everything, and anyone without strength wasn't even considered to be human." Sonny shuddered. He could imagine it vividly. This was, by far, the most cruel and bloody time in the history of the Bright Castle. Right after the last member of the original cohort to conquer the ancient stronghold had perished and before Gunlog took control, things balanced at the edge of madness for a while. Say what you want about the bastard, but at least he kept the humans here from turning into animals, completely. Sonny continued. But Gunlog, he turned out to be mad even by those standards. Because he actually began to hunt in the Dark Sea. Changing Star blinked. "What?" He nodded. "Yes. At dusk, he would dive from the city wall into the black water to scavenge the soul shards from the monsters of the labyrinth that were crushed by the flood, racing against the approaching horrors of the depths. And at dawn, he would dive into the retreating sea to scavenge meat from the remains of creatures that the dwellers of the depths had killed and left behind." Nephias silently stared at him. They had met the abominable existences that hid beneath the black surface of the cursed sea twice, and each of these harrowing meetings had left scars on their souls and minds. To do so twice a day, every day. Gunnlod was indeed a madman. But he was also somewhat of a mad genius. Sunny took a deep breath. And this is how he turned from a desperate outcast into the Bright Lord. One day, Gunnlod was pulled away by a current and, once the sea disappeared, stumbled onto a mortally wounded, dying Leviathan. The creature was still alive, but just barely. Knowing that the carrion eaters of the labyrinth will soon come to feast on it, Gunnlod began cutting the meat of the creature's bones with his knife. He paused, then said in a strangely dark voice. By chance, the Leviathan happened to die from its terrible wounds at that exact moment. And since Gunnlod's blade was the last thing to cut it, the spell happened to attribute the kill to him. And that kill happened to give him a memory. A wondrous golden armor that no human weapon can even scratch. No one really knew a lot about the dwellers of the depths, but Sunny and Nephice had once witnessed two carapace centurions retrieve two transcendent soul shards from the carcass of one of them. Which meant that Gunnlod's armor-type memory was at least 3 ranks above the soul cores of every human on the Forgotten Shore. Almost every weapon-type memory they possessed was either of dormant or awakened rank. Even if someone managed to kill a fallen creature and acquire an ascended weapon from it, the weapon would most likely still be ineffective against the transcendent armor. And since that damn armor didn't have any openings. Basically, Gunnlod was invincible. Sunny sighed. With that armor, he returned to the Dark City, gathered a few supporters, killed everyone who stood in his way, and took control of the castle. No one was able to threaten his reign ever since. And all those who tried, well, their skulls are out there for everyone to see, swinging on chains above the gates of the castle. Nephice remained silent for a long time, staring at the floor. She seemed to be a bit disheartened. Finally, she asked. What traits does the armor possess? He shrugged. Who knows? It's not like anyone who had the opportunity to learn that lived to tell the tale. The only thing widely known about the golden armor is that it is made out of some strange liquid metal and that it emanates a field of crushing psychic pressure. But even that is not entirely true. Actually, it only affects those who look at their reflection in the visor. Cassie wasn't affected at all. The blind girl raised an eyebrow, only now learning that everyone except for her always felt incredibly oppressed in Gunnlod's presence. For once, her terrible flaw gave her an advantage. It had also allowed Sunny to learn a valuable secret. But he had no time to be happy about it. The most important part of this conversation was drawing close. He had to convince Changing Star to abandon any idea of going against Gunnlod. Otherwise, all 3 of them were going to end up dead. Sunny looked at her and asked in a carefully neutral tone. So, what do you think? Changing Star was quiet for a while, then suddenly said. I have also learned something while you were gone. Sunny frowned slightly. Was she trying to avoid this conversation? Feeling heavy and uncertain, he asked. Really? What is it? However, in the next second, he had forgotten all about his previous worries. Because Nephice looked him right in the eyes and said. There is a gateway here, after all. Something exploded in Sunny's mind. What, there is a gateway. Stunned, he stared at Neph with wide eyes. How could this be? Why hadn't anyone ever mentioned it? No, it didn't make any sense. If there was a gateway, why would people just stay in the Dark City? Why were both Effie and Castor so adamant that there was no way out? A familiar dark feeling of unease settled in his heart. Trying to compose himself, Sunny slowly said. Then why hasn't anyone left? Where is it? Nephice looked at the window, remained silent for a few moments, and then answered in a flat tone. Where do you think? It's in the Crimson Spire, of course. Chapter 150 Hunting Party. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The Crimson Spire, that eerie and ever-present shadow that had hunted him all this time. The Cyclopean tower that stood at the center of the labyrinth, or maybe was the source of it, emanating a harrowing sense of foreboding. The background for the last part of Cassie's vision. Of course, the damn gateway just had to be in that damn spire. Sunny sighed. This was unwelcomed, but not unexpected news. After all, Inspector Rock did warn them that, should they ever find themselves in a region of the dream realm without an established human citadel, they should look for the gateway either around or inside the most prominent landmark there. The Crimson Spire loomed over the entire forgotten shore like an axis connecting heaven to earth. It was hard to imagine anything more prominent. Ever since Cassie had first told them about it, deep down, Sunny always suspected that they were going to end up having to enter that creepy tower at some point. After the revelation that there was no gateway in the human castle, that suspicion only grew stronger. But, wait. There was something else that Instructor Rock had told them. Work together to defeat the Gateway Guardians, wasn't these his words? So who is guarding the Crimson Spire? Glancing at Nephice, he asked darkly. So what is inside the spire? I gather that it's not something pleasant. Otherwise, there wouldn't be 1,000 sleepers choosing to live in a city full of vicious monsters instead of going there. Changing Star nodded. Without changing her expression, she looked away and answered. A fallen terror. Sunny's heart skipped a bit. A fallen terror, the nightmare creature one whole class above the dreaded tyrants, with 6 mighty soul cores providing it with profane power, would certainly do the trick. So, going there is suicide. No amount of sleepers could ever hope to defeat a fallen terror. The possibility of surviving such an encounter, let alone emerging victorious, was zero. It was even less probable than breaking through Gunlog's indestructible armor. Impossible. He chuckled. What irony! To not only be trapped in this hell, but also be forced to stare at the path to freedom every day, knowing that you'll never be able to reach it. That was such a cruel torture. Sunny would even go as far as to say that it was a type of hell in and of itself. No wonder the Tower of Dusk was so unpopular. Living there would simply drive some people insane. They were really, truly stuck here forever. Nephi sighed. The first ruler of the Bright Castle led a large expedition to find a way out of the labyrinth. They all perished. The second ruler, the last member of the original cohort, tried to reach the gateway instead. They all died, too. After that, no one tried to find a way out anymore. The 3 of them remained silent for a long time, their mood grim and somber. Now that they had a chance to spend some time in the small human enclave on the Forgotten Shore and gather information, there were no more excuses to deny it. Everything that Effie had told them was true. They were going to spend the rest of their lives here, however long that might be. Sunny sighed, then looked at Changing Star. So, what's the plan? Nephice looked at the vista of the ruined city through the window. Sunny was sure that she had already thought a lot about their future. He just hoped that her thoughts were not too crazy. After a while, she said. We will create a hunting party. Not too bad. Despite the fact that becoming independent hunters was going to be a long and perilous journey, it was at least achievable. They just had to be smart and careful about it. He scratched the back of his head. Going into the dark city blind will be very dangerous. Nephi shrugged, then turned to face him. You are right. We will need to recruit a pathfinder. Someone who was already experienced and could teach them the ropes, that would certainly speed things along and make the whole process safer. Good thinking. Do you have someone in mind? She gave him a nod. As a matter of fact, I do. We will go see her later. But first. Her eyes gleamed with intensity. Tell me every detail of what you have learned in the castle. Every name, every aspect. Every ability and flaw you've been able to glean. Every grievance people have and every agenda they're hiding. I need to know it all. Sunny smiled. Sure, no problem. But be warned, this is going to take a while. I've been very busy snooping around, you know. For the first time since receiving his aspect, Sunny had been able to do what he had planned to do from the start, gather information without risking his hide, as a real spy should. After months of bloody battles and open confrontations, it was strangely rewarding. Changing Star gave him a nod. There's no hurry. Several hours later, Sunny was finishing his winding report, his voice hoarse from all the talking. Dot is actually the same Pathfinder who the hunter from the outer settlement, Jubai, accused of using another human as monster bait. A real nasty fellow. He is an incredibly formidable fighter and is good at his job, but his personal habits, well. The man is a degenerate gambler. He spends all his shards in Aiko's gambling den, then refuses to pay and hurts anyone who dares to object. He took a breath, then added angrily. Some people even say that this whole challenge happened because he wanted to hunt a powerful monster and pay off a part of his gambling debt. The bastard. Then, Sunny thought for a while, scratched his head, and said. I think that covers pretty much everything. Of course, there are a lot of things I wasn't able to learn at all. Nephice was in deep thought, digesting the mountain of information that Sunny had thrown at her. Her face was cold and distant. Feeling that her friend wasn't going to react, Cassie patted him on the shoulder, smiled, and said. You've done a very good job, Sunny. This is amazing. He blinked and looked aside, slightly embarrassed. Well, of course it is. That is what my aspect is actually for, remember. The whole monster-slaying thing is nothing but an unfortunate misuse of my talents, honestly. Yeah. I would much prefer to stay hidden somewhere safe and let my shadow do all the work. The shadow slightly turned its head and threw a menacing look his way. It was not amused. Sunny smiled, then looked at Nephice. So, who is the Pathfinder you want to recruit? There can't be a lot of experienced hunters in the outer settlement, right? And each of them must have their hunting party already. How are we going to persuade one to join us? Changing Star lingered, then said in a strangely tense voice. Yes. Everyone who is worth something has their own party, except for one person. But persuading her won't be easy. She sighed, then added. Actually, you already know her. It's Effie.